Imagine waking up to a world where the familiar landscape of global trade, money, and finance has drastically changed. The dollar is no longer the currency leader, representing a break with nearly a century of dollar dominance. What is dollar hegemony? Literally, it means dollar leadership, and it offers the United States both economic and geopolitical leverage. But it also affects things in our daily lives. It creates conditions for stability in our economies. We gain access to goods, services, assets. It affects the price we pay for them, and it affects the international order in which we live. So how did this happen? The dollar's rise actually started in World War I, or after World War I, when Europe lay in ruins and needed reconstruction loans from the United States. The United States effectively became banker to the world. And the dollar gained prominence. But then the Great Depression happened in 1929, and it hit the US hard, as well as the dollar. After the Second World War, the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944 changed everything. Global leaders agreed to tie their currencies to the dollar, which in turn was tied to gold. Now, that system lasted for about 3 decades. The dollar became the dominant currency once again. But it came crashing down in 1971. The problem was that dollars were rapidly being converted into gold. Why? Well, there is something called the Triffin dilemma that explains this. The United States supplies liquidity, but there's a tension with maintaining the value and confidence in the dollar as a result. And it is named after the economist Robert Triffin. So in 1971, President Nixon, on the advice of John Connally, pictured here with a shotgun in Nixon's office, took the dollar off of gold. They severed the ties to gold. And at that point, many predicted the downfall of the dollar system. But the dollar actually thrived and adapted in this new environment of flexible exchange rates. One of the things that the United States had done to promote dollar use was to convince oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia to price oil in dollars. And in exchange, they received security guarantees from the United States. And today, oil actually accounts for a small portion of global trade. But path dependencies and network effects have persisted, and the dollar remains the go-to currency. So how dominant is the dollar? Well, it is very dominant. It is clearly number one in the currency hierarchy. And the euro is a distant second. The Chinese yuan lags far behind. When we determine the currency hierarchy, one needs to think about this a little bit differently than, for instance, if we're looking at the hierarchy of global billionaires. It's not the value of the dollar that matters. It's the extent to which dollars are used. And I say this because the dollar system, dollar hegemony, can persist even if the value of the dollar is not strong. There are a number of benefits from the system both to the United States, to Americans, and to foreigners. So for the American government, they gain monetary flexibility and lower borrowing costs. I mean, these lower borrowing costs should not be exaggerated in comparison to other advanced economies. The United States government also gains a geopolitical tool. Withholding dollars can be used punitively against countries that do not abide by international norms, or I should say perhaps the United States' preferred version of what should count as international norms. American citizens also benefit. They gain access to easy borrowing and credit. American businesses and banks gain foreign investment, and this also trickles down in the form of job creation. And of course, there is the prestige that comes with the cachet of issuing the global currency. There are costs to Americans as well. Foreigners gain access to the American market of consumers and assets. In return, the United States becomes a net importer of goods and capital, and rather than a net exporter, and so there is a potential cost and downside to certain domestic industries within the United States. For foreigners, they gain exchange rate stability by tracking or even pegging to the dollar. And they also gain simplified trade, investment, and even currency exchange. There are costs to foreigners as well. They can become overly dependent on U.S. monetary policy, and they are vulnerable to economic coercion by the United States. So there are both external and internal challenges to the system. And I want to take a little bit of a closer look at, who these challengers are. China and Russia view dollar hegemony as a symbol of the United States' overbearing ways. And they try to counter America's economic and political domination in various ways. For China, for instance, they seek to promote their own currency, the yuan. In bilateral trade, they've created their own payment system. They provide yuan to foreign central banks via swap agreements. They have launched a digital yuan for easier, more efficient transactions. And what China does actually does matter, because it is conceivable that they could one day provide a viable alternative to the dollar. Now, for Russia, it is much harder. They are a smaller economy, and they act mostly as spoiler. And they try to undermine the dollar system in various ways, bypassing the dollar, privileging ruble and Chinese yuan rather than the dollar. In fact, Russia started to de-dollarize prior to their second invasion of Ukraine in 2022. They've also created their own financial messaging system so that they do not have to use SWIFT, the bank identifying system that we all use for international wire transfers. We tend to place a lot of emphasis on these geopolitical challenges, but actually there are threats from within U.S. borders as well that are quite important. Political polarization within the United States is a threat to dollar hegemony. Constant debates about whether or not to move the debt ceiling undermines confidence in the dollar. And there are certain domestic political factions that oppose the dollar system. So, for instance, the House Freedom Caucus and Christian Reconstructionists believe that a return to the dollar gold standard would be beneficial and impose limits on government spending. Social media celebrities, Jack Dorsey and Elon Musk, have also championed cryptocurrencies for their gold-like stability. And they do not care much for the dollar because they believe that it is only backed by the full faith of the American government and their promises, and they do not place much value in such promises. So if we look at this in a longer-term perspective, from the days following the Nixon shock up until today, there's been some decline. There's been some decline in the dollar's reserve role. So if we look at the figure here, clearly the dollar is not as dominant as it once was. On the other hand, the dollar as a reserve currency is stronger today than it was right after the United States won the superpower competition with the Soviet Union. In other words, at the height of US primacy. There are three scenarios, I think, for the future. I believe that it is very likely that dollar hegemony will persist. But there are two other possibilities, and one is a shared bipolar currency order with the euro. So the dollar and the euro together share currency leadership. And the third possibility is shared status between the dollar, the euro, and the Chinese yuan. There are orders of difference between bipolarity and multipolarity. A bipolar order would be relatively similar to the order that we have today, although it would be a more unstable and volatile order. Geopolitically, it would not change much because the United States and the European countries are mostly aligned on geopolitics. If we were to move, however, into a multipolar order, things would change drastically. China would gain, or at least share, a tool for economic and geopolitical leverage in order to shape the world according to its own preferences. I believe that we are at a critical inflection point today because of the conflation of international and domestic threats. We need to recognize these risks in order to address them. And today there is very little debate about what these fundamental changes could possibly entail. Thank you very much.